So obviously we've heard about some great science and some great approaches. So obviously you guys represent what I would say is like a kind of a portfolio platform play. Obviously you've got you guys, Life Biosciences, Altos Labs, how that's obviously starting to come into shape now. James, in your opinion, is this the model for safe investment activity, or is there still a role for traditional biotech investment?
So everyone can hear me okay?
Yep.
And could everyone hear Phil's question about, is this sort of roll-up approach the way that biotech investment is going to be done?
Yep.
So traditionally, most breakthroughs in the biotech space were what I call single hypothesis breakthroughs. You've made a discovery, and that discovery that happens at an academic lab or at a pharma company gives you an opportunity to make one drug or even a series of drugs targeting the same kind of pathway that hopefully will work in humans. And in early days of biotech VC, folks would say, okay, well, we're going to give you a pile of money to go run a clinical trial to see if this thing works or not. And you would have usually a pretty good idea if it was working or if it was not working way before that drug hit the public markets. In the last 5 years, we've seen a transformation in the funding, the source of funding for early stage biotech companies. Public markets have become a much bigger part of the early development of drugs. And so instead of having a venture capital firm, which is taking a whole diversified set of bets on these individual hypotheses, what has happened is there's been this focus on taking individual companies that call themselves platform plays, right? A single discovery that gives the opportunity to make a whole bunch of different drugs. One that we're all probably pretty familiar with from the past couple of years is like Moderna, right? That made this discovery about how to use mRNA as drugs and has a whole pipeline, a diversified pipeline of different drugs based on that mRNA discovery. And so VCs realized that public market investors would be interested in these types of breakthroughs because it gave them diversification. But what and sorry I'm taking a long time to answer this question, Phil, but I think the historical perspective is really interesting here. Because most breakthroughs in the scientific space, and certainly in our longevity field, remain single hypothesis breakthroughs, right? Oh, you have an opportunity to regenerate the liver. You have the opportunity to, build new muscle, to exploit this pathway to fight fibrosis or whatever it is. And those companies have had a really hard time finding their way in this new funding environment on their own. They're extremely high risk, and a lot of the new money coming into biotech from more generalist sectors doesn't want to take that kind of binary risk that will be 1 or 0. Like Greg was saying, you take 10 shots on goal, you try to get 2 right. And so companies like Juvenescence or like Cambrian that want to build this portfolio is, I think, the way that biotech companies developing drugs that can that are working with individual breakthroughs from around the world, those are going to come and kind of roll up into these what we call distributed development companies or hub and spoke model. Like that's just going to be the way that these types of breakthroughs will live on the public markets. And I think we're going to continue to see this trend away from those companies going to public markets or being acquired by pharma companies on their own as kind of one-off pieces. And instead, you're going to get a lot more investment activity around these hub and spoke model companies.
Yeah, great. And Greg, obviously, your portfolio is quite varied beyond pure biotech as well. What are your thoughts on the platform play and the portfolio play?
I'm still trying to find the VC who wants to throw money at me, whoever he or she happens to be. We talked about it. Obviously, it was part of the presentation. Sort of be humorous if I said it's not the right model now. I think that it's very, very important to do it. It's the right way to play, particularly when you're going to the generalist investor. If you're going to the biotech investor, they'll say, I don't need you to pick. Let me pick. I'll pick my portfolio of what it needs to look like. So that's a little bit of a swing, but then it's just where you're getting your money from. And because our goal is to make the ultimate, great return for our shareholders. So where can I get the least expensive money that gets me through those inflection points? And generally, the general public is much better because the VCs want, 10x return in 5 to 7 years, where a public investor is over the moon if you gave them a 15% return, a year. So it's just different metrics, and so we have to be able to exploit all the opportunities.
Okay, great. And James, obviously you shared some interesting slides there about your pipeline. What's the commercialization model for Cambrian? Are you going to go to IND and then license, or are you going to go all the way through? What's the plan?
Yeah, so I always wish that I could share more on the scientific side. We've been intentionally somewhat stealthy about our pipeline thus far since starting Cambrian. So, next year, if we come together for Longevity Week again, hopefully I'll be able to punch through a few interesting pieces of science, then we'll be a little bit more public with stuff. But to answer that, I think this whole field, like I was talking about, is around what I think of as two stage gates. The first is using fundamental breakthroughs in the biology of aging to find drugs that target those causes of aging to treat diseases today. And then the second step will be to take those now safe and effective drugs and use them to prevent disease. And so I think it's tempting to build an organization that takes the upside just from the first part of this 1-2 punch, and then will kind of offload a lot of the IP and so on to pharma companies at that phase 2 proof of concept stage with the first indications. That is going to be a door that's open to us, but it's actually not the way that we're building Cambrian. So when we sign up for a project, we actually want to be one of the first longevity pharmaceutical companies, not just a biotech company, which means following something all the way from early discovery through commercialization. Will we commercialize every one of our 16 programs? It depends how many of them work out. If we have 1 or 2, then we can probably stomach that commercialization ourselves. If we are actually scientifically batting way above average and we end up with 5 or 7 or something like that, will we end up having to find partners? Yes. But when we sign up for a program, it's because we want to commercialize it for the first indication. Then we want to open the regulatory door to test it in healthy but aging populations at risk and commercialize that too, and be an entirely new type of pharma company over the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, so that 20, 30, 40 window that you were talking about in terms of approvals, that's where your roadmap takes you there. And will your funding take you there, or have you got to be another couple of rounds in between?
Well, so $100 million, which is what we just raised, and about $160 million total for Cambrian, about $400 million total for us and our portfolio companies. That's a lot of money, but biotech is very expensive. And so, what's that?
I said we might.
Yeah, exactly. And so the way that we think about capital raising is that, even though in biotech you don't sell a product until after a drug is approved, you are still creating fundamental value by de-risking extremely valuable intellectual property. And if you're creating fundamental value, then the same logic about capital raising applies as would in any other business, which is you don't want to take in more than you need to reach your next inflection points. So we've raised a fair amount of money at Cambrian, but we've actually turned down more than we've accepted because we want to demonstrate more value, grow the portfolio, make more scientific progress, and then we'll accept in a little bit more later and accept in a little bit more later. My estimation to investors is that in order to build a diversified clinical portfolio that makes it all the way through phase 2, we're going to need about $500 million to do that correctly, and then you continue to scale from there.
Wow, there's a lot of cash in the sectors we all know, and a lot of money to go in various places. But Greg, if I could maybe just change the tack slightly onto talent. Obviously, you laid out quite a diverse portfolio and a diverse skill set as well. I mean, do you feel, we've heard Altos are starting to hoover up people and stuff. Do you feel that in terms of the way that talent is now looking at the longevity sector and companies like yours attracting very diverse skills, is that going to be something that is going to become an opportunity and a challenge for you as an organization and others in the sector?
Yeah, Altos, which Phil refers to, I think is Bezos and Milner. And they've been taking some of the top scientists to bring them together to work on regeneration. And, it's great. They're the scientists, and that's fantastic. And then, do you assemble the drug developers? Do you assemble the scientists? Is an interesting question as to how to move a project, our various companies forward. I think that there is going to be a demand for talent. When an industry starts basically 5 or 7 years ago in this sector, There's not a lot of people who are super experienced, so there's not a huge depth of people who say, oh yeah, I regrew a limb. There's like 3. So there's going to be a absolute demand for talent. As far as the diversity of talent, I think that because we all want aging to be a disease, so we can get a code so that we can get paid by the various governments or healthcare systems or in medical insurance in the U.S. But definitively, it's not a disease; it's a process, and it's a very complicated process. And so, to have that diversity of talent is so very important. It's why things like this are so important, because you bring scientists and different people together, and all of a sudden you find extraordinary things. There's a circle of Willis in the brain, and when it was worked on, it was probably one of the first documented multidisciplinary teams. I think I can't remember if it was Oxford or Cambridge, but basically Willis brought together an artist, he brought together a philosopher, he brought together a politician, and each one of them brought different aspects. And I believe the politician was Penn, and I think the artist was actually an architect named Robbins. Is he the one who did St. Paul's Cathedral? And so each of them came away with the brain now, not the heart, being the center of the body. So this multidisciplinary team created this extraordinary thing, and then went on to create parliament, to create architecture with domes, And so I think that it's really important in our sector to get that multidisciplinary look at how to do this, because to truthfully, modify aging, there's so many aspects. I've got to deal with sleep, I've got to deal with your diet, and we need an eclectic group to address it.
Yeah, and because of the diversity of the sector, we were looking recently at ovarian longevity as a really untapped and interesting area. And I saw, James, that was on female health was on part of your portfolio. So not necessarily focusing specifically on that, but are there other sectors that either of you are looking at that you're not working in next and now that you feel are going to be the next opportunities for you?
So let me say somewhat flippantly, if we were, I wouldn't announce it. Mm-hmm. But I can give sort of a framework view to this. Is that in 2013, the field came together and a number of eminent scientists in space published this review called The Hallmarks of Aging, which I think has been an inflection point in how we think about this field. But those 9 hallmarks of aging that came out in 2013, that's a list or kind of a collection of our scientific understanding that continues to change as more and more research is done. And so the 13 focus areas that I talked about with Cambrian are, kind of a blowing apart of those 9 hallmarks, adding in the new science, deprioritizing things that we don't think are druggable today, and highly prioritizing the things that nobody else is really working on and that we think is druggable today. And I think actually in the women's health space, it's one of these spots that has been largely ignored by the pharmaceutical industry, which is one of the things that allowed us to find some really cool projects in women's health that I hope to be able to talk about more next year. And so by continually revisiting breakthroughs that are being made by scientists in this field and in ancillary fields. I think one of the things that, we have Jim and Nir and Richard and folks that have been fundamental in shaping the geroscience academic field. But one of the things that has been so inspiring to me is you have all of these scientists who a decade ago would never have called themselves geroscientists that now are, right? And are kind of, so the tent of what this aging field is increasing as more fundamental scientists working on dementia or cancer realize that these fundamental causes of aging are actually the same things that their research is leading them to. And so by keeping our pulse on the field in that way, we can continue to grow our tent and our focus into new areas, which is not a very satisfying answer to your question, but it does, I think, encapsulate the approach.
Yeah, understood. But I mean, Greg, do you feel there are underserved areas in the sector?
I just saw Elon Musk's presentation on the neural link, and they have a monkey that is using just its mind to manipulate a screen. And how that fits into this aging process, I'm not sure, but I'm sure it'll evolve in time, because that was just extraordinary. If you haven't seen it, I don't know where you can get it, whether it's online, but it's amazing where this monkey is literally manipulating a screen just by thinking.
Yeah, I mean, we're very big fans of neurotech, actually, because we feel that's a very fundamental part, even from sleep management and things like that. But we have got some questions in from our audience today. So I'll do the first one. So Nir's quite popular in asking questions in these sessions. So we've already got one from Nir. So Nir's was, how do we not become anti-aging 201, in particular with nutraceuticals? We need clinical data while not killing everyone. We are trying to build a reputation. So I guess that's more of a statement than a question, but there's another one, which is another one that we hear a lot of, which is what, if anything, are your companies doing, or the sector doing, to plan towards the issue of global warming? And I guess this is the sort of population discussion and the active engagement of people in their later lives. So 2 questions in one.
So do you want to jump on the first part of that?
It doesn't matter. Go ahead.
So on the first point about not being anti-aging 201, right? I think for many of us that have been watching this field for a long time, we're, almost talking about the second or third even peak and trough of this space, where because the topic of slowing the rate of aging is so philosophically attractive to people, it is a real tendency for anyone to approach this field with a positivity, an optimistic bias that, oh, hey, if this is a theoretical possibility, let's try to figure out how to get money to flow into it to make it happen. And so we have to take that positivity bias into account if you want to build a real long-lasting company in this space. And so one of the things that was sort of a founding principle of Cambrian is that when we create our whole pipeline of drugs, we do risk modeling to evaluate the potential of each of them as if they were independent, standalone biotech companies. And you can assess using modern risk modeling how much each of these assets is worth with, a 5% chance that it's going to succeed or a 15% chance that it's going to succeed or whatever rate. And then there's this kind of lurking giant in the background of like, okay, but what if you can use this as a longevity drug to treat healthy people for aging? And if you allow that like lurking giant to be anything except 0, it dominates the overall value story of the company that you're trying to build. And so we made a very intentional decision to actually set the whole value that we account for in Cambrian of this whole longevity space to 0. And are building value only based upon the existing biotech prospects of each of the companies that we're moving forward, and say, look, here's our hard-headed assumptions without the regulatory risk of how we're going to build these drugs in the here and now. And if you end up with a drug that works for a rare disease, then we're going to use part of our budget to explore this slowing aging hypothesis. And if it works, great. We're going to do well, and you're going to do well as our investors also, but we're not going to try to price that in today. Mm-hmm. And I think taking that kind of attitude allows you to build, I think Greg pointed this out in your presentation, you can build a multi-billion-dollar company around a great portfolio of good drugs. And then if you take that multi-billion-dollar company and you say, also we can use this in healthy people to slow aging, now you've just got a fantastic story. And that sort of financial discipline is what I think has separated this environment of the longevity space from previous ones that primarily worked based on the promise of the social or the philosophical angle of slowing aging.
So to go to the second part of your question on global change, if I'm time limited on the planet Earth, maybe I'm not as aware of the climate, because by the time I'm gone is when the climate's going to get rubbish. But if I'm living here for another 200 years, I need to worry about the climate and what's going to happen globally. So maybe it'll, in sort of a weird way, it will make people more aware that, what they need to do as far as that aspect. The other interesting thing, because, James and I do a number of presentations on these, and you're asked, what happens with, population if everybody's living longer and things like that, and food. If I took all 7.8 billion people, I built a city the density of Hong Kong or New York City, every person, all 7.8 billion people would fit into Texas. So it's not a space issue. If right now, as most of you are probably aware, we don't make 50 or 100% of the food we need for all 7.8 billion people. We make 200%. So it's not a food issue. And with the foodscapers or whatever they're calling them, Jim probably knows it better than me in agronomics, where they're going to build buildings where, you will have locally grown fantastic vegetables in a skyscraper in the middle of London. So I'm not worried about that aspect of it. And then the other thing, whether it's the ethical issues of living longer and how that's going to affect, one of the great questions was, how will our mental health be affected if we're living to 200? And we don't know the answers. And I don't think we could try to predict it because, it's chaos theory. There's so many variables that could come into the equation on this. But I'm not, I understand Nir's point about the aging and 2.0. I think that we're actually seeing a little bit of 1.0, 2.0. A number of products didn't work in the first go around publicly, but I think we're learning from those. And much like the internet, you saw 1.0 and 2.0, and I think that we'll see that as well, and maybe a 3.0 in this case. It's evolving as far as the exciting areas and everything else.
Well, James, I'm so sorry, but we're out of time today. We're kind of compressed, but if you don't mind joining everybody to thank them for their time today, it's been very interesting.